Welcome. I am Arthur Carter, Assistant Professor of New Testament and Director of Black Church Traditions and African American Faith Life here at Phillips Theological Seminary. On behalf of our President, Nancy Pittman, and our Interim Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs, Lisa Davison, it is my honor to welcome you to the third annual Black Histories and Native American Lands Lecture. Here at Phillips Theological Seminary, we are a small freestanding graduate seminary of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. This institution is proud of its progressive liberal orientation and maintains an ethos centered around ecumenical pursuits of justice, justice in society, justice in the academy, and justice through the church. Our setting here in Tulsa, particularly in northeastern Tulsa, neighboring North Tulsa, lands largely designated for Black freed persons and Afro-Indians, provide an immediate context for understanding the intersectional and historical relationships of race, nation, religion, class, and land. This is a time where our country continues to wrestle. We're wrestling with memory and the right to narrate one's history. We're wrestling with memory and the right to narrate national history. We are a country that continues to wrestle with empire and justice. We debate and we wrestle with citizenship. So as we continue to wrestle in this context and laws are being passed that restricts the stories that can be told and upon what narratives those stories can be framed, we remember Black subjects and their lives are contributions that are legislated and shackled to narratives that often support skewed and limited perspectives that ignore and elide the lived experiences and the lived values of these very individuals. Yet Black subjects are not the only subjects banned and blocked from study and narration. Native American and Indigenous stories are often the object of erasure, exploitation, and appropriation. And it is precisely by leaning into our own context here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that we are able to have this lecture series. Because we here at Phillips seek to take serious the space that we occupy. A space erased and ignored when we're thinking about the history and the legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so with this, it is my honor and in my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. Dean Barbara Krauthammer is an eminent historian of slavery and emancipation in the 19th century American South. She's a devoted mentor and an innovative leader. In July 2023, she became the Dean of Emory University's College of Arts and Sciences. She's a widely recognized and leading historian of African American slavery and emancipation. Her published works include Black Slaves and Indian Masters, which you'll see the cover here. And she's the co-author of Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, which received a number of honors, most notably the 2013 NAACP Image Award for outstanding literary work and nonfiction. She co-edited the textbook Major Problems in African American History, which was once a leading textbook in the field. In addition to this, I could spend the next hour just telling you all the things that she's done. But at this point, let me go ahead and get out of your way. And I now welcome Dean Barbara Krauthammer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Carter. That was a lovely introduction. And I want to thank you and the entire Phillips Theological Seminary community for having me with you virtually tonight. It's my pleasure to be with all of you and to have a chance to share some of my work and some of my thoughts with you, and hopefully share some discussion through a virtual platform if there are any questions or comments at the end. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you just about the theme and share a couple of different vignettes with you around the theme of seeing freedom, right? And thinking about the legacies of slavery and emancipation in that area that was once called Indian Territory that we now know as the state of Oklahoma. What I'm going to focus on is really sort of a nice blending of two of my books that are featured behind you, Envisioning Emancipation and Black Slaves, Indian Masters. to think about and to invite our audience to think about the question of how do we see freedom? That is right. What does it mean to be free? What does freedom look like in our minds, in our hearts, and even in our eyes, right? How do we know when someone is free or when we are free? Through what we see. As a historian, I'm always interested in how people's freedom, and for me in my area of research, I'm talking specifically about Black people's freedom, but also stories of Native American freedom, how these histories are documented and how they've been obscured in the archival record. And I think, even in our own present day, we can think about how histories of Black Americans, histories of Native Americans are being obscured in the way we talk about national history, the way people are discussing how to teach American history. And so this is always something that's on my mind, right? Of how are histories documented, how are histories hidden, sometimes literally erased. And finally, for me, the top priority is to think about how can we continue to recover histories, right? Histories of Black people, histories of Native American peoples, and how can we continue to recover those freedom stories? That is, those histories that tell about the different ways in which people struggled to be free, free on their own terms, and free in ways that were meaningful to them. So tonight I want to share a series of photographic images. So we'll be looking with our eyes, looking at images of enslavement and freedom to think about those legacies of slavery and emancipation, Black freedom in Indian Territory and Oklahoma, right? What does freedom mean on those native lands and lands that we know in Oklahoma, right, that were lands where people, Native peoples and Black people had been forcibly relocated, lands that were continually the site of contested struggle, struggle among Native peoples and Black people, Natives, Blacks, and white Americans, as well as local and federal government officials throughout the 19th century, the 20th century, and in some respects, through to the present moment in different ways. So I'm going to start, if we can go to the first slide. This is an image. Oh. So what we're going to see in a minute is an image that's a portrait of an enslaved woman. Oh, here we go. There we go. This is a portrait that's not from the West, not from Oklahoma, not from Indian Territory, but from Georgia. And I wanted to start with this image for a couple of reasons. First of all, Georgia, where I'm sitting today, are the ancestral homelands of those Native nations, the Creeks, Cherokees, some Chickasaws and Choctaws and Seminoles, who were ultimately forcibly relocated to Indian Territory, Oklahoma. So geographically, so much of this history rooted in the land and migration across the land. But this is an image of an enslaved woman named Dolly. And what this document is a notice. You can see at the top, it says $50 reward. And the short version of the story is that Dolly escaped in 1863 from her owner in Georgia during the Civil War. She ran away, and she was owned by a man named Charles Manigault, who owned hundreds of people, hundreds of men, women, and children, owned them as property, enslaved people. And she was the only one who was ever able to escape successfully and never be recaptured and re-enslaved. So for me, starting with this picture of Dolly is an important way to think about the history of Black freedom and Black people's struggle for freedom, right? Often involved, again, movement, mobility, secrecy, um, and absence, right? We don't know what happens to Dolly after she escapes, right? So her story of freedom is a story of absence. Um, it's documented here in this notice that her owner writes. He describes her as beautiful. He says she's probably been enticed away by a white man. That actually wasn't true. In fact, she left with a Black man who was her suitor. So she left with the person of her choice. She was not lured away under false pretenses or anything, as her owner would have people believe, right? So suggesting that she was incapable of imagining her life as a free person, incapable of strategizing and planning an escape. The man who owned her said clearly she was lured away by another white man. In reality, we know she deliberately left with a Black man of her choice. So her story embedded in this photograph then is a story of a woman as an intellectual, as a self-motivated individual, but also a story of absence, right? We don't know what became of her. The other thing quickly to point out is you'll see the photograph is cropped at the shoulders. We can't see what's sitting below her. And one hypothesis is that she's holding a white child, that she's holding the child of the family who owned her. And if we can go to the next slide, I can show you an example of what that kind of photograph would have looked like. So this is a photograph from about 25 years previously, from 1848, but very typical of the genre of a Black enslaved person caring for a white child. Right, a very common genre of family photography, if you will, that white slaveholding families had made to show off not only their child, but to show off their wealth and status, that they could afford to own an enslaved person to care for their children. The question, of course, becomes, where are these women's children? Right? Where was Dolly's children? Where is this woman's children? If we go to the next slide, please, that'll take us actually to the west, to Oklahoma. This is an image from the Oklahoma Historical Society. And the archival entry for this image is titled Ex-Slave of Ann Mickle and B.F. Kemp. So the gentleman who's driving this wagon and driving this white child in the wagon isn't given a name, right? We know he's free. This is an image that was taken probably at the late 19th century. We know he's a free person, right? We know he's lived through enslavement, lived through the Civil War, lived through emancipation, and that he's free. But his archival presence is documented in relation to his enslaved status, right? His previous enslaved status, not maybe how he would have defined himself, right? He's not given a name. He's not identified in relation to his family members. So again, there's a sense of absence. We don't know what became of his children or grandchildren. You know, I like to imagine he probably had grandchildren who would have loved to go for a buggy ride with him, right? But that's not how that history is captured. But what we can do as careful viewers, careful thinkers, as individuals who believe, as Professor Carter, you said so beautifully in the beginning, who believe in the pursuit of justice, right? The pursuit of dignity that accompanies justice, right? Of recognizing people's humanity. We can imagine that this gentleman has a full life, right? That he has a family, that he survived enslavement, we know, but that he survived enslavement with a sense of himself, with a sense of his family and his commitment to his family, that in some we can see here, you know, embodied through the work that he's doing, probably for wages, other forms of subsistence, maybe some food, maybe assistance with housing, right? But that this image where he's documented simply as an ex-slave is really can be read as a story of his labor, right? And his dignity. And we can think about his missing family. And one of the reasons I like this picture and the problems, right, the historical problem that it poses of not naming this man and not allowing us to see him in his full community context, is that I think it encapsulates in many ways the complexity and contradictions of the intersections of African American and Native American history in Indian Territory and Oklahoma. Right? We know that enslaved African Americans were forcibly relocated to that region in the 1830s and 1840s as part of the history of Indian removal, right? Of the forced dispossession and dislocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans from the Deep South, from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. So that there's this intertwined history that we can almost think about as multiple intersecting levels of exploitation, dislocation. We can date it back to the Middle Passage and the forced migration of enslaved Africans, and then think about successive waves of forced migrations of enslaved African Americans, and in this case, Native Americans, who are recognized as free people by the United States government, by local state governments, and at the same time are not recognized as full people, right? As fully human, entitled to ancestral lands, entitled to the full dignity of their humanity. We know that these intersecting histories of African American enslavement in Native American nations often have multiple competing and seemingly contradictory narratives. There are many narratives of acculturation, right? Of people of African descent embracing, adopting, and holding on to aspects of Native American culture, whether it's food, whether it's language, whether it's certain aspects of their dress, and that this all dates back to the 19th century, to that period of Indian removal to the West, and African American participation in that forced migration. But those narratives of acculturation, right, of shared foodways, shared ceremonial experiences, sit very uncomfortably, but very close alongside narratives of abuse and exploitation, right, of enslaved African Americans who were abused and exploited by Native Americans, who themselves were in a moment, a historical moment, of being exploited and often abused physically, socially, economically by white Americans, as well as by the national government, right? So we have these conflicting and competing narratives of the ways that people came together, the ways that enslaved African Americans and Native Americans came together and built a shared culture and shared experiences alongside narratives of enslaved children being sold away from their parents, right? Of enslaved women being abused, of enslaved men being beaten. We can think in that context of family histories, right? Family histories that are born out of voluntary relationships across those lines of enslavement and freedom, voluntary relationships between African Americans and Native Americans, to branches of family trees that were the products of acts of sexual violence, right? And coercion and a lack of consent. And so again, we have these complicated histories of shared culture and conflict, of family histories born of both genuine love and profound violence. Sometimes what happens in some narratives about Indian Territory and African American enslavement is that there were very few plantations in the Indian Territory. Most Native Americans who owned enslaved African Americans owned only one or two people and would sometimes hire or rent another enslaved laborer to work on a small family farm. There were very few large plantations that are sort of the typical image of Southern slavery. And often that absence of plantations is confused sometimes in the scholarship, I think, and sometimes just in our general knowledge, that the absence of large-scale plantation agriculture in the land that would become Oklahoma is sometimes confused with an absence of brutality or dehumanization. And we have abundant documentation of that kind of brutality and dehumanization. For me, and what I want to focus on a little bit more tonight is what's more important to me is that the narratives of these intertwined histories can often fail to center, really truly center, Black people's intellectual and spiritual wholeness, right? That is the sense of themselves as individuals, family members, community members, who were from the earliest moments in time fully endowed with the capacity to think, to feel, to love, to fear, to aspire, to the capacity to believe, right? The capacity to have meaningful faith that could direct their actions and inform their actions, the capacity to strategize, to compile and analyze information and evidence and make informed strategic decisions. And finally, the capacity to act, right? And to act in ways that were sometimes highly visible and act in ways that were sometimes less visible, but nonetheless were clearly deliberate, intentional acts designed to advance a sense of freedom, a sense of dignity, and a real sense of humanity. One of the things that is really fascinating to me about this history in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, is how interconnected it is to a wider US history and a wider history of African Americans throughout the United States. So if we can go to the next picture, please. I want to share another example of this. This is an image that was made in 1854 of a woman named Sarah McGill Russworm. Now, this image was not only not made in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, it was not made in the United States or even North America. This is a photograph that was taken in Monrovia, Liberia, by an African-American photographer named Augustus Washington. He was a well-known photographer in the Northeast. He probably learned photography in New Hampshire as an apprentice. He had a photography studio in Connecticut. In the 1850s, Augustus Washington, the photographer, and a number of other African Americans left the United States to settle in Liberia. The reason they went to Liberia was because, for a number of reasons, all stemming from the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act passed in the United States, right? Federal legislation that made it even more difficult for enslaved people to free themselves, right? So enslaved people who escaped from their owner and made it to a free state, made it to New York, made it to Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, were still considered legally someone else's property, even though they had made it to a state where slavery had been abolished. Frederick Douglass is a prime example of this. He escapes from slavery in Maryland. He makes his way to Massachusetts, but he is still legally recognized as an enslaved person, the property of his owner in Maryland. So the Fugitive Slave Law imposes harsh penalties for anyone who assists an enslaved person in their escape. It imposes harsh penalties for simply knowing that there is a formerly enslaved person who has escaped. Simply knowing about them and not reporting them to the authorities is considered a federal crime. The law also, and this will be a theme through the 19th century, the law also holds that Black people cannot testify in their own defense, right? They cannot make a case for their freedom, a case that they had purchased their freedom, which is always a contradiction that I struggle with, the notion of having to purchase yourself or purchase your family member. But they couldn't offer testimony in their own defense. So after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, a number of African Americans leave the United States voluntarily because they believe that the land is too dangerous for them to be here, that they're in danger of being kidnapped and sold into slavery falsely. And they believe that that Black people will never achieve a meaningful freedom. The case of Solomon Northup that was made into the movie 12 Years a Slave a number of years ago is a case of a man who was free and was kidnapped and enslaved, right? Falsely enslaved. And that's a good example of the kind of fear that so many people have. So the Fugitive Slave Law extended into Indian Territory. It extended the reach of federal authorities to capture enslaved people who ran away from the surrounding states, so maybe Texas or Louisiana, and tried to hide in Indian Territory. The law set the stage for white authorities for those surrounding states to violate Native American sovereignty, Native American rule of their own territory, to capture those African Americans, perhaps who had escaped from Texas or Louisiana. The other thing that links these African American, Native American histories to the wider US history is that this idea of emigration, of leaving North America for Liberia, for the thought of being in a Black community that was safe, right, where freedom could be meaningful, both personal bodily freedom, legal freedom, and even spiritual freedom, reaches Indian Territory in the 1850s. I'm going to turn to a passage that I wrote about this. A number, and of course I don't have reading glasses on, so I can't really see. If you can go to the next slide, though. Great. This is an envelope that's sent back to Indian Territory from Liberia. Liberia held great appeal to African Americans in Indian Territory in the 1850s, particularly those who had joined Christian churches led by white missionaries in the native lands. A number of individuals, usually young men, sought to leave Indian Territory and go to Liberia. There was a man named George Freeman who purchased his freedom. He was owned by a missionary. He worked off his price. Again, imagine having to purchase your own freedom. He purchased his freedom and left Indian Territory in 1852 to go to Liberia. A small contingent of individuals tried to leave in the fall of 1852, but their ship was struck with cholera, and so they perished. But again, a freedom story that involved migration, right? Again, leaving one location that could be considered a homeland to try to create a home in another. The story that I want to share that's relevant to this letter here is about the only immigrant from the Choctaw Nation who left a written record of his experience of leaving Indian Territory to go to Liberia. This was a man named Reverend Simon Harrison, who was training to be a minister. He left Indian Territory for Liberia in the spring of 1853. And he left with the explicit agenda of working as a teacher and a minister in Liberia. He had been owned by a Choctaw master. Methodist missionaries had intervened to obtain his freedom. So his freedom had been purchased for him. Missionaries then appealed widely in the northeastern United States to raise money to purchase Simon Harrison's freedom. So it meant that in various missionary newsletters, and newspapers and publications in Boston and New York, for example, there would be an appeal from missionary, a man named Cyrus Kingsbury, who was in Indian Territory, asking for donations so that Kingsbury could pay the purchase price for Simon Harrison and raise the funds to send him to Liberia. So white donors, as well as some free African-American donors from the States, raised, along with the missionaries and we believe some donations from the handful of free Black people in the Choctaw Nation, raised about $2,000 to send Simon Harrison, his wife, and their 3 children to Liberia. Now, we know all that from the missionary records. What we know from the Reverend Harrison is that they arrived finally in Liberia, and he wrote back to Reverend Kingsbury to tell of his safe arrival. And he also wrote back with his impressions of Liberia, which were not especially favorable. He was disappointed by the climate. He was disappointed by the deprivation of material resources. There was malaria, often plagued the community. There were food shortages. It was a hard life, right? So Reverend Harrison went to Liberia hoping to find a meaningful freedom, but found more hardship. When he first arrived in Monrovia, when he first disembarked on the coast, Reverend Harrison learns that he has to take another voyage, another boat inland, to go inland. And he writes that he was dismayed, quote, that he could not yet be released from another water passage, right? So he writes that he's upset that he cannot yet be released from another water passage, having to take another ship. It didn't feel like freedom to him. And to the contrary, he writes that he has, quote, long since learned the lessons of obedience. I was willing to submit, meaning he was willing to endure another water voyage. And so when we think about that as a freedom story, and so this, how this relates to this image here is, this is the wrapper, effectively the envelope of one of the letters that Reverend Harrison sent back. You can see it says to New York City, to Walter Lowe, New York City, in the mission room, right? So he's sending this back to his fellow missionaries to tell them about his experience. And the experience is that he's gone on this quest of freedom, but he hasn't yet found a freedom that resonates with him, right? And to the contrary, and I always think, as he's lamenting having to take that second water journey, of how evocative it is of a reverse middle passage, right? That he's gone back to Africa, and even that is not liberating for him, right? That there's still hardship, and he still feels that he has to submit to forces around him rather than have an experience that feels like true liberation, where he can be a teacher, be a minister, be a community leader, and feel safe and secure. I think in the interest of time, if you can, well, let's go. I'll take you quickly through 2 more images that make me think about Indian Territory. This first one is a picture from the South, I believe from South Carolina, but I could be wrong, of Civil War photographers. And what's notable is that there's an African-American apprentice who we think was probably learning to be a photographer. And if you go to the next image then, please. This is the back of a photograph of a white photographer who was licensed. So this is basically his advertisement, and then the reverse side would have photographs on it. And so this is basically his advertisement of his services as a photographer in Indian Territory in the 1890s. And he says that he has a license to come into the Creek Nation, and he details on here the towns that he goes to take photographs. One of the things I suspect but haven't yet been able to confirm, so maybe someone who's listening tonight will be able to find in a family photo album or a box in an attic or a basement confirmation, is that we know that by the 1890s, Black Americans, as well as Native Americans, have their pictures made, have sit for these itinerant photographers who travel around the region to have portraits made of themselves, of their families, of their communities, to document their history. Right. And the freedom aspect of this is unlike those images that I showed earlier of Dolly or the gentleman driving the buggy, who didn't have the opportunity to create their own photos, to tell their own history of life in Indian Territory. People who paid an itinerant photographer who went to a photographer's studio would be able to craft their own image, to document their own history, tell and preserve their freedom story. So if we go to the next picture, we can see some of these documented images. So this is probably, to many people who are watching this evening, a familiar picture, right? It's a picture of formerly enslaved people from the Chickasaw Nation who were filing for their land allotments. So we know after the Civil War, the United States government enters new treaties with the Native American nations in 1866. And in short, the treaties require, in fact, Native American governments to do more than the federal government of the United States has done at that point for formerly enslaved people, which is it requires the Native nations to grant formerly enslaved people the full rights of citizenship and to share the land with them. Right? Now, this is all part of a Native history of the federal efforts to end Native sovereignty, that is the right to self-government, and to end Native control over that vast expanse of land that will become Oklahoma. Nonetheless, what's striking to me about this picture is the woman who's facing the camera, right? There's an African-American woman facing the camera wearing a gorgeous dress with an intricate pattern, wearing a lace bonnet, right? She's dressed in her best clothes. Those are not work clothes. Those are church clothes, probably. And the gentleman sitting next to her and the gentleman sitting in that row along the wall behind her, for the most part, are wearing jackets or ties. So these are people, right? Often when we think of civil rights struggles, right, when we think of a fight for freedom in the 19th century after the Civil War, we imagine violent conflicts. And certainly there were many violent conflicts and conflicts over land, over Black freedom and citizenship in Indian Territory. But this to me is as important a document of a freedom struggle and a freedom campaign by showing us the ways that Black women and men insisted upon their rights to claim land allotments as the marker of their freedom, the way they knew themselves to be entitled to these rights and also entitled to the dignity implied in the rights of freedom and citizenship, right? Dignity that's manifested in their dress, right? That these are people who worked and got dressed and came to register for their allotments. Again, though, and if you go to the next slide, I really do want to emphasize and be respectful of those overlapping histories, that this moment of Black freedom. So this is an image of the all Black town of Nicodemus, Kansas. This was settled by Black migrants from the Deep South, places like Louisiana, as people were fleeing Klan violence and other kinds of violence. Also settled Black towns like Nicodemus, settled by men who had been enslaved in Indian Territory, joined the Union Army, and then mustered out on the border of Oklahoma and went to Kansas again, looking for land, looking for a place to put it down roots, have families, have communities, have meaningful freedom. But the image of Nicodemus, even though we can't see the detail of the individuals, we can certainly get a sense of the landscape, right? And a sense of both the constant hope of this quest for freedom in this region, right? Black people's constant resilience and willingness to move someplace new in the quest for freedom, in the fight for freedom, and also the isolation of it, right? You can look here, there's not much to speak of in the town of Nicodemus in 1885, right? There are two buildings, and then it's homesteads and farm. So we can imagine both a sense of constant hope and also the real profound isolation that this kind of freedom struggle would entail generation after generation. The other thing for us to remember as we think about the intertwined histories of African Americans and Native Americans is that Kansas is the next location where Native peoples are dispossessed of their land to make way for white settlement. And in fact, there's this period of time where there's some debate in the federal government about relocating Indian nations from the region that becomes Oklahoma, to Kansas, again, to continue to sort of push Native peoples off their lands in an effort to make way for white settlers. So we have sort of these multiple levels, again, of forced migration and dispossession and voluntary migration as part of a Black freedom struggle, right? So Black former soldiers mustering out, some settling in Black towns in Oklahoma, in your region, not far from Tulsa, and also in places like Kansas. The last area that I want to touch on is the importance of education. The importance of education as a cornerstone of a Black freedom struggle in Indian Territory and frankly across the southern states, as well as throughout the entire United States, but certainly for those who had been held in bondage, held in slavery, the absolute vital importance and real value that people placed in education in those decades after emancipation, from the 1870s through the early 1900s. And I think of something that was often said by my grandfather, right, which was you had to get an education because it was the one thing that people couldn't take away from you, right? That no one can take your education away from you. So freedom in this shared African American, Native American context for Black Americans was really defined by a relentless pursuit of education. And we can see again in those photographs and thinking about them as historical documents of this region and of this time, we can see education as the embodiment of Black people's intellect and of Black people as thinkers and writers and creators and intellectuals, both women and men. And when we think about Oklahoma, right, the birthplace of thinkers and scholars and artists, men no less than John Hope Franklin, the great historian, Ralph Ellison, and then really one of my favorites, right? Jazz trumpet great Don Cherry, right? All from that region, right? All successive generations, later generations of these early forebears who are engaged in this struggle for freedom to make land meaningful, make citizenship meaningful, and to make education meaningful. So you'll see some real similarities in the next three images from across the South of schools. And I like this. So this is a freedmen's school in North Carolina, right? From right at the end of the Civil War. And then you can see all the students assembled in front with their white teachers. And then go to the next one. This is a school, right, from 1891 in Oklahoma. Again, right, a school for Black students, all dressed beautifully. It's called a manual labor school. People are learning skills, they're learning trades, but they're also learning literature. They're learning what today we would call critical thinking skills, right? They're bringing to their education a sense of themselves as thinkers, as intellectuals. And then I think there's one more school picture that brings us back to Georgia. Yeah, this one someone just shared with me recently. And so my other lesson is that many of us, I hope, have boxes of photographs in, family albums in the attic, in the basement, that really are treasures. And so this is an image from a private collection that was just shared with me of a women's school in Macon, Georgia in 1906. Right? This is a period where lynching is at its all-time high across the American South. And yet we still have these young women dressed in their finest, committed to their education, right? Education as the tool, the weapon of freedom, and also the shield against the brutalities that were leveled against Black people, not just in Indian Territory, right, but across the South. So I want to end now by going back to that picture that I first showed you. So if we can go to the next slide, right, again, I want to end, and I hope maybe somebody out there knows this gentleman's name. The archival title again is Ex-Slave of Ann Mickle and B.F. Kemp. And I want to end with the question that I started with, right, of how do we see the legacies of both slavery and freedom in this picture, right? What can we see? What can we imagine? And what can we document by sharing family stories, community stories about the freedom struggle? So I'm going to end with a couple of family pictures, because I truly believe, both in my scholarly brain and deep in my heart, believe that the greatest pictures of what freedom means and how we can see the legacies of both slavery and the capacity for survival and the capacity for freedom, that we can see that in family photographs, maybe more than any place else. So that may be telling you more about me than the documents. But if we can go to the next slide. This is an image from the 1880s in Montana, right? So we have Black people who are migrating through native lands in the West and settling in places like Montana. Usually the people who are settling there, again, intertwined histories, often the families of those Black soldiers who were known as Buffalo Soldiers, right? Who are part of the US military in the 1880s, 1890s, and are part of those campaigns against Native nations in the Western states, again, to dispossess Native peoples of their territory in the West to make way for, primarily for white settlement. But we know also there's some Black settlers who benefit from that dispossession of Native peoples. But what if we think about this in the 1880s, right, this is a legacy of emancipation, because all those three young girls there are freeborn children, right? They are part of this early generation after the Civil War that's born free. The next slide, please. This is a photograph, again, from Georgia. And in fact, this woman is related to that last picture, someone in the last picture that I showed you of the school girls from Georgia, but of a woman named Mrs. Minerva Black, who was born into slavery, lived through the Civil War, and she's holding her freeborn grandchildren on her lap. So if we think about that first photo that I started with of the woman named Dolly who escaped from her owner, and that second photo of the enslaved woman holding her that white child, her owner's child on her lap, and contrast it, right? Or even the photo of the gentleman driving the buggy with the white child, and contrast it with this, right? And what would it have meant for a formerly enslaved person to hold their freeborn grandchildren? And so let's go to the last picture. So this is a man named Charlie Wilson in Oklahoma. Mr. Wilson, born into slavery, survived slavery, lived to see emancipation, holding his freeborn granddaughter on his lap, right? In Oklahoma, on the land where he had been enslaved, where he can now claim his freedom and celebrate his granddaughter's freedom. We know that these freedom stories exist in many families. We know that they are intertwined with painful histories of enslavement and equally painful histories of Native American dispossession, loss of land, loss of sovereignty. We know that education for so many generations of Native Americans had a very different meaning for those children who were sent to boarding schools and taken away from their families and who lost their lives in boarding schools. And so as we think about the markers of freedom at these intersections of African American, Native American history, I think the challenge for all of us is to be mindful of the ways that freedom campaigns are never easily defined. What marks freedom for some people can mark marginalization, exploitation for other people. And so I like to think that both the obligation and the privilege that we have when thinking about these histories is thinking about the nuance, both the joy and the beauty, and also recognizing the pain and the struggle, and appreciating and learning from the nuance and the ways in which, in my work, the ways in which African Americans really sought to make sense of how to gain a meaningful freedom in a world that was not designed to support their freedom and was not designed to support Native American autonomy, and to try to carve out a space or multiple spaces where they could enjoy and define freedom for themselves. So I will stop there, and I'm happy if there are questions, to take questions or comments or thoughts.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was rich. There was so much in there that I would like to touch on. But what I'm going to do is I'm initially going to ask a question just while we give, there's a slight delay. So while we give some of our viewers an opportunity to catch up to where we are.
Sure.
I was really moved by one of the last things that you said. It's an obligation and a privilege for us to tell these stories. And could you just tell us a little bit about how you were drawn into the material photographic, the use of this type of material culture to begin to narrate, but sometimes you're not even narrating, you're inviting us to rethink. What drew you to the use of photography to question these stories?
It's a great question. One of the things that I noticed when I was working on Black Slaves, Indian Masters, right? You know, you write a book and then the publisher says, great, go find some images, find some maps, find some pictures. And I and a number of colleagues who research in the same field, you know, all pretty much use the same photographs. And one of the things that I started to notice over time in different works and, you know, on websites and things was often the photographs were presented with very little context. And sometimes even, and there was one documentary filmmaker who said to me, you know, after he heard a presentation I gave, that he realized he had been using a photograph incorrectly, that because he had been identifying it with a different era, right? And he had, in his work, had been saying, you know, that this image, it was an image of some elderly women, formerly enslaved women, who were, you know, much later pictured in the 19 teens. And he said, you know, I always used it as a World War I era photo, but it's not, right? It's from before. And so that really got me thinking about, and again, especially for African-American photography, historical photography, that there were so many images that circulated as sort of stock illustrations of slavery or the Civil War, with little regard for the individual stories. And so to me, it felt like there was kind of a replication of stripping people of their identities and their humanity.
Thank you. No, it was interesting, and I would stay there for a moment, but I do have a couple of questions from YouTube. And so at one point you briefly alluded to voluntary associations and voluntary relationships, and then those that were forced. And so one of the questions from our viewers asked the question, could you say a little bit about like what type of, like, how can, excuse me, and I just lost the question. The gist of the question is, where slavery exists, what is voluntary? You know,
exactly.
How do we go about, how do you wrestle with, or do you wrestle with this notion of depicting quote unquote less abusive or voluntary? Could you just talk us through discussing that aspect, both in the in Indian territory and potentially in Southern U.S. plantation culture?
Sure. I would say generally, I don't think there can be, I mean, and this is my position, right? But I don't think there can be a lot that's voluntary. When I refer to that in this context, though, in Indian territory, one of the things that I am mindful of and really strive to be respectful and understanding of is there are people who are descendants today, right, who narrate a family history that is one of, you know, what in their family histories is a voluntary or mutual relationship, right? As a scholar, right? So as an individual, as a person, I really do want to be respectful and mindful that for some people, that's the family narrative, that's the family history that is meaningful to them. As a historian, as a scholar, yes, I would suggest, you know, say that I struggle with thinking about what is voluntary in a situation where one person is owned as property by another person. That said, we do also have documentation of people who were free, who entered into relationships with other free people, African-American, Native American relationships. So, again, I think the caution of being mindful of nuance is always important. But yeah, I hear you.
No, thank you. I will now move to a question that I was absolutely fascinated. When you noted um, the in the 1850s the participation in the colonization of
Yeah.
Liberia being particularly related to missionary founded churches in Indian territory. I
Yeah.
was not aware that that was something that was actually that there are at least a significant number of families or individuals that participated. Now, so I asked two questions. First, was this official kind of like integration with the American Colonization Society, or are these separate?
Connected to American Colonization Society.
Okay. All right. And so when we're thinking about that, would you say something about we had Elena Roberts
Oh yeah.
give a lecture, and she talked about the triangulation of empire. And could you say something about um, uh, was it Reverend Harrison, I think,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
his pursuit of freedom and emancipation, um, basically in a colonization effort, right?
Yeah.
And so, how do we begin thinking about the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of safety, um, through the means and mechanisms of colonization and displacement? Could you just have you thought about, have you written? Is there anything that you could say just about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, you hit the nail right on the head. And, certainly I know Elena and her work very well, and she does too. I mean, that's exactly, it's not unlike one of those last family photographs of the woman with her children in Montana, right? Of Buffalo soldiers, right? Get a salary, get a pension, are able to settle because they've waged these wars against Native nations, right? These US campaigns, right? And that is another route to freedom. Um, and so, I mean, I often feel like this is sort of the eternal conundrum when we think about freedom. And, as much as we can look at sort of how those legacies of slavery and emancipation continue to resonate in Oklahoma, we could have a similar kind of conversation um, about Liberia over the generations, right? And which Liberians from the 19th century through the 20th century um, controlled wealth and power. Um, it was generally not indigenous Liberia, people who are indigenous to the continent, right? It was those people who came, as you noted, um, and their descendants, right, as part of a colonization effort. And so I think that's a real, um, I think it's a real conundrum that we have to wrestle with. And I don't know that there's an easy answer, but it is a
No,
persistent problem.
no, I appreciate it, and I would be remiss if I know I'm jumping all around here. Please, anyone that is on YouTube, if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to. We have a few more minutes to engage our speaker tonight. Um, with it being March and Women's History Month, and saw so many of your photographs or of women, is there anything that you could add or nuance in terms of some of the research and the experiences, particularly about women and either mechanisms of freedom, their experiences, thinking about our various subjectivities? In what ways might you seek to re-narrate um, women in Indian territory, so forth and so on, in different ways? Are there other things that you bring, knowing that patriarchy and other forms of of sexual and gender abuse exist? Um, could you just say something about that?
Sure, that's an area that's really very important to me. So thank you for asking. Throughout my work, right, one of the things that I have tried to do is to center women again as historical actors, right, as thinkers, as planners, as doers in their own right. And again, I think that's for historians, the thing that I always say is the sources are there, right? The documents are there. It's a question of how you read them, right? And we can go back to the previous question about voluntary or coercive relationships. And can you, if you read the WPA slave narrative, ex-slave narratives, for example, which have all sorts of issues and problems and challenges on their own, you read the narratives, women's narratives, and also some men's narratives from Indian territory, you read carefully, you can find examples of women very clearly talking about the kinds of abuses they suffered. I mean, they don't say it graphic, like what we would describe today as graphically, but it's very clear, right? It's very clear, but you have to read for it, right? And you have to read for the implications and the nuance of, if a woman says, my husband was so-and-so, and my owner is the father of my child, that should prompt people to ask some more questions about that woman's life, right? And it should also, I think, raise a flag for us of what did it mean for her to say that, right? To document that in a narrative, is that, and like, she's basically calling out her abuser, right? She's opening herself potentially to criticism, shame, stigma, but she's also owning her experience, right? So I think there's a lot, and I think, that kind of careful reading of text documents is really important. There's a episode that I write about in Black Slaves, Indian Masters, of the Choctaw Harkins family, and one of a man named Prince kills his Harkins owner, and then it's the women who work to cover it up and to help Prince. Ultimately, they're all put to death as punishment, but it's the women, right? And when you read sort of the testimonies that are sort of compiled, it's the enslaved women who are sort of the strategists behind the scenes. But again, you have to read for the nuance and pay attention not to the person who wielded the axe to kill the man, but the person who then tried to hide the axe, right? Like, that's an important role.
Excellent. And I've got a couple more, and then we're going to let you go.
Okay.
In terms of material culture, because I know it's not just photographs. What other forms of material culture are you invested in, and what's next? I know you just took a deanship. so what's in the word processor, right?
What is literally truly in the word processor, and a perfect segue from your question about women, is a history of enslaved women who escape and make freedom for themselves during the Revolutionary War. And on the material culture side, there are again some interesting things, but it's more no photographs in the 18th century, but textiles, cooking implements, the things that women use to make a living and to make a home.
Excellent. No, we will look forward to it. And the last question I'll have revolves around, you've talked a lot about reading history. Reading the past, reading artifacts, remembering. I firmly believe that narrating history, that historiography is a vitally important task. It's extremely important. just in and of itself.
Yeah.
Accepting that, what does this particular charge that you provided us with, in addition to history for history's sake and all the good things associated with history, how do you see its relevance, or what do you think that this project is telling us today? Like, why, not just scholars, why would you charge our society broadly to do this type of project outside of it's good to know about the past?
It's good to know about the past. And I think now more than ever, it's a way for us to, even if we have to start with our historical imaginations, to see ways that A, people navigate difference, B, ways people try to make the world better, and C, find the times where people come together, right? And I think, it feels to me now more than ever that if we can continue to read history as a way of understanding people who are different from ourselves, right? And we can understand that we can relate to someone's experience totally different from ourselves, different from our own experiences, our own family's experiences, but we can see some sort of shared, whether it's love, whether it's fear, whether it's hope, whatever it is, maybe we can bring that to our present a little bit more.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Again, we are so appreciative. We did, I want you to hold on for a moment after we release. We did have someone on YouTube that has noted that they do have some family photographs, so we might be able to get you in contact with this individual. And everyone online, whether you're online live tonight or whether you're streaming in after today, we really appreciate you for being here for our third annual Black Histories in Native Lands lecture. Again, we thank Dean Barbara Carthamar for her time, her expertise, and her perspectives. And I also invite all of you to keep up with all of our events here at Phillips Theological Seminary. On April the 5th, we will be partnering with we'll be partnering with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, where they will be sharing a film called God Talk: Reimagining Faith in the 21st Century. They're going around the country and selecting select sites to actually screen this film, and we will be screening this film on April the 5th. And both the director and the curator for African American religious history, Teddy Reeves and Erica Galt, will be here in Tulsa on campus here to have a discussion following the film. Also, on April the 29th, I would like to announce that we will have the Tulsa Race Massacre lecture. We invite you to come here. Tracy Hucks, who will be our keynote speaker, while we will also be releasing Halim Flowers, a brand new installation in our art gallery. Again, thank you so much for being here. God bless and take care.